The wind scraped across the New Mexico desert, carrying dust and despair. Miguel Alvarez stood over the cracked earth that had once fed his family, ready to give up everything. But when he rescued a burned, half-wild horse from the canyon, strange things began to happen. The animal wouldn't leave the ridge, and where its hooves struck, the scent of rain rose from beneath the dead soil. The sun over the Chihuahuan desert bled through a veil of dust, painting everything in copper and sorrow. Miguel Alvarez lifted the last bucket of water from the cracked barrel and poured it onto the roots of a dying walnut tree. The soil drank it greedily and gave nothing back. Around him, the wind hissed through brittle sagebrush, carrying the faint scent of iron and smoke, like the earth itself was mourning. His hands, brown and calloused, trembled slightly as he pressed them into the dirt. "You've given all you could," he whispered, unsure if he was speaking to the land or to himself. The tree stood silent, a skeleton beneath the blazing New Mexico sky. Behind him, the wooden door creaked open. "Dad?" Daniel's voice was thin, uncertain. The boy's shadow stretched long over the dust. "This land is dead. You need to sell before it kills us too." Miguel didn't look up. He had heard this argument too many times, but something inside him still resisted the words. "It's not the land that's dead," he murmured. "It's us who stopped listening." Daniel sighed, the sound sharp and young. "Listening won't bring water, Dad. Desert Pure will pay enough for us to leave this place, go somewhere with real schools, real life." He turned and walked away before Miguel could answer. The old farmer leaned against the dry walnut trunk, eyes following his son's fading silhouette toward the adobe house at the edge of the field. Beyond it stretched miles of red earth, shimmering with heat and emptiness. That night, Miguel couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch beneath a moon thin as a blade, listening to the groan of wind through the fence posts. Each gust carried ghosts, his wife's laughter, his father's voice, the rhythm of rain long vanished. Somewhere out there, in that ocean of sand and basalt, the earth still held its secrets, but he no longer knew how to hear them. Just before dawn, a sound broke the silence, a faint, uneven rhythm echoing from the arroyos behind the barn. It wasn't wind. It was heavier, deliberate. Hooves. Miguel grabbed his lantern and stepped into the cool, pre-dawn air. The desert smelled different then. Less like death. More like breath held between prayers. The sound grew louder, echoing off the basalt walls until it filled the night like a heartbeat. At the ridge, his light caught movement. Something large and dark limping through the dust. A Mustang. Its coat shimmered gray-black, the color of cooled ash. Smoke scars streaked its flank. Its mane clung in burnt clumps. The animal staggered once, then stopped, head low, eyes wild and glassy with fear. Miguel froze. Wild horses weren't rare out here, but this one felt different. The wind shifted, and he saw a faint burn mark around its neck, as if it had escaped a fire. It looked at him, and for a second their eyes met, two creatures clinging to the edge of survival. He whispered, almost to the wind, "Easy, boy." The Mustang's ears flicked. It didn't bolt. Instead, it snorted softly, pawed the ground once, and lowered its head. Miguel's breath caught. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe trust. Either way, it felt like the land had just spoken back. He led it slowly toward the barn. The horse followed, limping but unafraid. Under the lantern light, Miguel saw the shimmer of old burns along its legs. "You've been through hell," he murmured, wrapping an old blanket over its shoulders. "Guess we both have." As he poured the last of the well water into a rusted trough, the horse didn't drink right away. Instead, it stepped closer to the back wall, where the basalt ran deep under the barn floor, and tapped a hoof against the ground. Tap, tap, tap. Then it looked at him. Miguel frowned. "What are you doing, boy?" The Mustang repeated it, 3 sharp taps, a pause, then one long strike. A hollow thud echoed beneath them. Miguel knelt, pressing his palm to the dirt. For the first time in years, it felt cool, damp. He looked up at the horse. The animal's eyes, dark as wet stone, glinted in the lantern light. "Maybe," Miguel whispered. "You're hearing something I can't." The first streaks of dawn painted the desert pale gold. The walnut tree still stood lifeless, but for a fleeting moment, Miguel thought he heard a murmur under the ground. A pulse. Faint, but real. The Mustang snorted once, sharp and sure, as if to say, "Listen closer." And for the first time in a long while, Miguel Alvarez did. The morning after Miguel found the Mustang, the desert smelled faintly of soot and rain that never came. The horizon shimmered under waves of heat, and every sound felt magnified. The buzz of flies, the slow creak of the windmill that hadn't turned in months. In the barn, the horse stood motionless, its breath rising like smoke in the slanting light. Miguel approached with a bucket of water drawn from the last inches of the well. The horse turned its head slightly, watching him through the shadows. The scars along its neck glistened faintly, silver threads against the black ash of its coat. "Cinder," Miguel whispered, as if naming the creature might keep it tethered to this world. "You look like what's left after fire." Cinder didn't move. But when Miguel placed the bucket down, it stepped forward, drank, and then, without warning, tapped its hoof twice against the packed earth. The same hollow echo. Miguel crouched again, pressing his palm to the floorboards. Damp, cool. It wasn't his imagination. There was something alive beneath the dead crust of his land. He went to tell Daniel, but the boy stood by the fence line, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes fixed on the dirt road stretching toward town. "Dr. Whitaker's back," Daniel said flatly. "He's doing geological surveys for Desert Pure. Maybe he can explain your miracle horse." "Miracle horse?" Miguel repeated, almost smiling. "That's what you think this is?" "I think it's desperate," Daniel shot back. "You've been talking to dirt and ghosts for years, Dad. Maybe it's time to talk to someone real." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Miguel's voice softened. "Real things don't always come with shiny trucks and contracts, mijo." Daniel looked away. The tension between them hung heavy as the desert heat. Unspoken love, buried beneath layers of pride and exhaustion. Later that afternoon, Dr. Neil Whitaker arrived in a dented jeep coated with red dust. The retired geologist stepped out, his gray beard catching the light, his eyes sharp despite the years. He carried rolled maps and an old compass, smelling faintly of tobacco and cedar. "Miguel Alvarez," he greeted warmly. "Heard you've got a story for me. Miguel hesitated, then nodded toward the barn. Inside, Cinder lifted its head, ears twitching. Whitaker studied the horse, then the basalt ridge beyond. "You say it keeps pawing the same spot?" "Every time," Miguel said. "And it's cooler there. Feels like water under rock." Whitaker crouched, running his fingers through the dirt. "Basalt traps aquifers sometimes. Old lava beds hold more than people think. You might be sitting on a shallow water vein." Daniel folded his arms. "So you're saying the horse found it?" "Come on." Whitaker smiled slightly. "Animals sense what we ignore. Sometimes it takes a creature without greed to tell us what's still alive." Miguel looked at the man's worn hands, tracing invisible lines across the ground. For the first time, hope flickered in him. Not as a wild surge, but a quiet ember, steady and cautious. Over the next few days, Miguel stayed near the ridge. He noticed details he had long forgotten. How the air grew heavier when Cinder approached the basalt wall. How lizards gathered near the shaded cracks. How the soil held faint flecks of green beneath its crust. One evening, as the sky turned the color of rust, Cinder began to dig. Not frantic, but deliberate, striking the ground with steady rhythm. Miguel joined in with a shovel, feeling foolish until the first trace of moisture darkened the dirt. It was faint, but real. He touched it and smelled iron, salt, and life. "You're hearing it, aren't you, boy?" he whispered. Cinder's ears flicked, and for the first time, the Mustang allowed Miguel's hand to brush against its muzzle. When Daniel returned that night, he saw his father sitting by the horse, lantern glowing soft on their faces. "You're still chasing ghosts," he said quietly. Miguel didn't answer. He just looked up at his son and said, "Maybe ghosts are just memories that refuse to dry up." Daniel turned away, muttering something about college applications and real futures. But as he walked back toward the house, he glanced once more at Cinder, and for a brief moment saw what his father saw. The horse stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the horizon, as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. That night, lightning flickered far away over the desert, and Miguel sat awake, listening. Beneath the low growl of the storm, he swore he could hear another sound, faint and rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat pulsing deep below the ground. When dawn came, the desert shimmered under a thin veil of mist, and Cinder's breath rose in silver clouds. Miguel stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat and dust from his brow. He looked toward the hills where basalt met sky, and whispered, "Maybe the land's not dead after all." Behind him, Cinder huffed softly, pawing the earth once, then twice, answering in the only language the desert still understood. Cinder's last hoofbeat still hung in Miguel's ears, a soft answer in a language older than fences, when the Jeep's engine coughed up the driveway, spitting dust the color of rusted pennies. Dr. Neil Whitaker stepped out with the tired elegance of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the earth like scripture. He offered Daniel a nod, then turned to Miguel with a paper roll tucked beneath his arm the way a preacher might cradle a hymnal. "Brought you a map," he said, tapping the cardboard tube. "Not the kind salesmen wave around when they want your signature. This one was drawn before Desert Pure learned to pronounce opportunity." The kitchen smelled like coffee burnt just enough to taste like memory. Miguel cleared the table, swept aside wrenches and a jar of nails, and watched the geologist unroll a fan of yellowed sheets across the wood. Lines of blue ink threaded through brown contours, thin as veins under skin. Neil smoothed the edges with his palms. "Basalt flow here," he said, tracing a black lacquer ridge that mirrored the horizon outside. "Old volcanic bed. Sometimes it acts like a dam, sometimes like a sponge. Depends where the fractures run. He tapped a series of faint marks. A sequoia used to run north of your walnut tree. See this notation? Dried up in '92. But the memories of water don't vanish. They just move. Daniel hovered near the sink, pretending not to care. Desert Pure says those notes are outdated, he muttered. They've got satellite imaging, sensors, the whole thing. Neil's smile barely lifted. Satellites read surfaces. What we need is a listener. He lifted his chin toward the barn. And you found one with 4 legs. Miguel felt a ripple of something inside him. Pride, maybe. Or relief that the voice in his chest had an echo in someone else's. He hasn't. Run, he said quietly. Not once. Then he's telling you this place still remembers rain, Neil replied. Question is, can we find where the memory sits? They carried the maps outside. The day had softened from molten to merely cruel. Sagebrush trembled in a hushed breeze, and a streak of cloud smudged the sky like chalk. From the barn, Cinder watched with the patient alertness of a sentinel. Neil knelt at the basalt lip where the horse had worked the ground smooth. He pressed his ear to the soil, then stood and handed Miguel a steel probe. Push where it feels reluctant, he said. Rock resists. Fractures welcome. Miguel set the probe and leaned his weight. The shaft slid a few inches, then balked. He shifted, tried again. This time it sank farther than it had any right to, like a breath taken after too long underwater. He pulled it out and sniffed. The tip carried a cool scent, a whisper of stone cellars and old coins. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Neil looked pleased, though caution tempered it. There's a chance, he murmured. Still needs proof. Proof costs money, Daniel said. And money's the one thing we don't have. They all stood silent a moment, the way people do when speaking would scatter the little courage they've collected. Finally, Miguel nodded toward the house. We can talk numbers. Inside, the air was darker, cooler. Miguel opened the old ledger where his father had once recorded cattle births, seed purchases, and the price of rain dances that never worked. He added a column in cramped handwriting. Fuel for pump test, drill rental, pipe length. The sum at the bottom made his throat go dry. We could sell the blue heifer, he said, and the spare baler teeth. Daniel eased into a chair, rubbing his thumb along a groove carved by generations of elbows. There's another way, he said, not meeting Miguel's eyes. Desert Pure has a community fund for pilot sites. They mentioned mortgage rates help if we sign early. Scholarships, too. The word scholarships hung in the room like a lifted curtain, a glimpse of a life with smooth floors and clean, bright water from kitchen faucets that never coughed. Miguel felt it like a bruise he kept poking. He saw his boy at a desk somewhere far from this table, far from these maps, wearing a grin the desert had never quite coaxed out of him. Neil cleared his throat, gentle but firm. Before you sell the well to the highest bidder, answer one question. Who owns water that moves, us or the story we tell with it? Water rights are tricky, but they're also moral. If you find a vein, you'll need to decide whether your name goes on a deed or on a promise. Miguel looked at his hands, soil packed under his nails, scars faint as old moons. My father used to say, "You borrow land from your children," he said, voice low. "I don't know how to return it if it's empty." It's not empty, Neil said. It's clever. It knows how to hide. They walked the property until the light turned a familiar amber and the shadow of the walnut tree reached across the yard like a tired arm. On the way back, Miguel paused at the edge of a panel of corrugated metal glinting behind the shed. The old solar array he'd built when the grid proved fickle still caught light like a stubborn optimist. "Does solar energy power a pump well enough?" he asked. Neil's eyes warmed. "Not a bad question. For a test, yes. For a full draw, depends on depth and flow. But it keeps your independence." Independence. The word tasted as clean as a first glass of water on a furnace day. Outside, Cinder shifted his weight and let out a slow breath, fogging the air though the heat had not relented. After sunset, the three of them sat on the porch. Crickets stitched the darkness together. Far off, thunder practiced without enthusiasm. Miguel poured coffee that could scour iron and passed the mug to the geologist. "Tell me one thing," Daniel said, voice softer than it had been in weeks. "You've done this before. You've stood on land like ours. Did it work?" Neil took his time. "Sometimes. Sometimes we pushed too hard and broke what we tried to save. I've signed off on drills that sucked valleys dry. I wake up at night hearing the echo." He set the mug down carefully, like placing a stone on a grave. "I'm here because I'd like to get one right." They were quiet then, three silhouettes framed by a square of light, each listening to the night for an answer none of them could demand. When the wind rose, it brought a coolness that made Miguel's arms pebble. The air smelled faintly of lightning and wet stone, a scent so delicate he almost mistrusted it. "Tomorrow," Miguel said, standing. His knees popped like old timber. "We run a proper test. I'll rig the panels and the pump. We measure. We write it down. No miracles, just numbers." Neil nodded. "And listening," he added. Daniel hesitated at the doorway, one hand on the frame. "If this works," he said, "I can still apply to state. Maybe study environmental engineering." He glanced at Miguel quickly, as if the hope might spook him. "I could help design a small system. Gravity-fed, low pressure, safer for floods, lower home insurance headaches." A laugh moved through Miguel before he could stop it. Uneven, a little rusty, like a gate swinging after a long time shut. "Look at you," he said, "already talking like a man who plans to leave a place better than he found it." The boy's face opened. Just a fraction. Just enough. In the barn, Cinder stamped once, then settled, as if accepting the plan. Miguel stepped into the dark and laid his palm against the horse's warm neck. "Tomorrow," he said again, "to the animal and the map and the sky and the walnut tree and the ghosts who had watched him fail and keep going. Tomorrow, we see if the ground remembers us." Night gathered the farm into a single breath. Beyond the house, the basalt ridge held its secrets like a closed fist. Somewhere under that black knuckle of stone, a thread of water waited, patient, stubborn, almost prayerful. And as the first fine dust of stars drifted into place, the earth felt less like a verdict and more like a promise about to be tested. In the thin hour before sleep, Miguel heard it. The quietest cadence. Not wind, not insect, not the ache of old wood. A pulse. He let it carry him inward, toward morning, toward numbers and wires, and a hole drilled into dark. He did not know what they would find, only that he would face it with his son beside him, the map spread open and the horse listening. By the time the horizon paled, there was already a coil of hose by the door and a stack of tools on the porch. Miguel tied his bandana, wiped dust from the small solar inverter, and looked to the ridge where Cinder waited, head high, ears forward. "Let's go," he said, the words landing as lightly as rain. By dawn, the desert looked less like a wound and more like a question. Mist drifted low over the mesa, pale ribbons caught in the first light. Miguel and Daniel worked side by side in silence, each movement deliberate, the tightening of bolts, the clink of metal on stone, the faint hum of the small solar inverter catching power from the waking sun. Cinder stood near the basalt ridge, tail flicking lazily, ears trained on every sound. To anyone else, it might have looked like a horse waiting for feed. But to Miguel, the animal looked like a compass, steady, patient, unwavering. Neil arrived just as the panels came alive with a soft, electric buzz. He carried a thermos of coffee and that same folded map, the one that seemed to have its own pulse. "If the probe finds pressure," he said, "we could be standing on a confined aquifer. That means the land's been saving water for years." Daniel adjusted the gauge, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And if we're wrong?" "Then we drilled into rock," Miguel said, forcing a small smile. "We'll patch the hole and call it a lesson." They worked through the morning, sweat darkening Miguel's shirt, Daniel's face flushed with effort. Every sound, the grind of the drill, the faint whir of the motor, seemed amplified by expectation. The probe sank deeper inch by inch, hitting stone, then easing through pockets of compacted clay. 6 feet, Daniel said, voice barely audible above the motor. 8, Miguel replied. At 10 feet, the drill bit stalled. A heavy vibration shook through the shaft, followed by silence. Miguel's heart stuttered. He knelt, listening. Then came a sound so soft he thought he imagined it. A faint hiss, like breath escaping from under the world. The drill gave a sudden jerk, and a thin mist rose through the opening. Daniel gasped. "Dad, that's moisture," Miguel finished, eyes wide. He reached down and touched the edge of the hole. It was cool, wet. For the first time in years, his hand smelled of life. Neil knelt beside him, eyes shining. "You did it. The fracture's live. It's small, but it's moving. The earth remembers." They widened the hole carefully, installing a short PVC casing to keep the sides from collapsing. The trickle that followed was shy, but steady. A fragile thread of water, dark as obsidian at first, then turning clear as it reached the light. Daniel dipped his fingers in, the tremor in his hands matching his father's. "It's cold," he whispered. Miguel didn't speak. He just looked toward Cinder, who stood at the ridge, nostrils flaring. The horse let out a low, satisfied whinny, the kind that vibrated through the chest, not just the air. It turned its head toward Miguel, as if to say, "You heard it too, didn't you?" The three of them sat back on the dirt, saying nothing. For a while, the only sound was that tiny stream whispering into the metal bucket. Then Daniel broke the silence. "How much can it give?" Neil shrugged. "Enough to fill a small reservoir. Maybe enough for the orchard, if you ration." The idea hung there, delicate and dangerous. Hope always was. As the sun climbed higher, the glint of water seemed to change color. Silver, then blue, then almost green. Miguel thought of the old acequia his father once maintained, the one that fed the walnut tree before the drought came. He imagined that same water moving underground all these years, biding its time. By noon, the heat returned, fierce and absolute. Miguel rigged a pipe from the drill site to a rusted trough by the barn. The flow was slow but persistent. Cinder approached and drank deeply, water spilling down its muzzle like liquid glass. The horse lifted its head, droplets scattering in the sun. Daniel laughed, a sound that startled them both. "He found it," he said, grinning despite himself. "He really did." Miguel turned toward him. "No," he said softly. "We listened. That's all." Later, as the day cooled, the three sat under the walnut tree's bare branches. The faintest shimmer of green had appeared at the base of the trunk, nothing more than a suggestion, but enough to make Miguel's chest tighten. Neil pulled out his notebook, scribbling readings: flow rate, depth, temperature. He paused midway, looked up at Miguel, and said, "You realize what happens now, right? Desert Pure will want data. They'll want control." Miguel's eyes darkened. "They can want all they like. This water isn't for sale." Daniel's smile faded. "But Dad, what if we stop thinking everything has to be bought?" Miguel snapped, then caught himself. He sighed. "I'm sorry, this isn't about profit, it's about staying alive." Daniel lowered his gaze. "You sound like Mom," he whispered, almost too quietly to hear. The name hung between them, heavy and sacred. Miguel felt the old ache stir in his chest. He hadn't spoken of her in months, maybe years. She had believed in this land long after he'd lost the faith. Neil cleared his throat softly, granting them both a moment to breathe. "I can file a protection notice," he offered. "Keep them from claiming rights until we test the basin properly. But you'll need to be careful. Once word spreads, you'll have visitors, reporters, company reps, maybe even the county water board." Miguel nodded. "Let them come. We'll show them." The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the desert in long blue shadows. As darkness crept across the yard, the faint sound of running water continued, steady and sure. That night, Miguel couldn't sleep. He sat by the barn, lantern dim beside him, watching Cinder doze near the trough. The Mustang's breathing was slow, deep, in rhythm with the flow beneath the ground. Every few minutes, its ear would flick, catching sounds only it could hear. Miguel whispered into the stillness. "You were right. The land wasn't dead. I was." Cinder lifted its head briefly, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern. Then it lowered its muzzle again and exhaled, as if forgiving him. Inside the house, Daniel turned in his sleep, dreaming of maps and wires and a small well that could change everything. Miguel watched the horizon, waiting for the first blush of dawn, when the desert would show its colors again. Rust, gold, and that rare, impossible blue that only comes after water has touched the earth. He looked once more at Cinder, then at the wellhead, where droplets continued to fall in slow rhythm. The sound was fragile, but constant. A promise whispered in stone. Tomorrow, he knew, Desert Pure would notice. But tonight, under the thin light of the stars, the farm was alive again. By morning, the air felt heavier, thicker somehow, as if the desert itself was thinking. Miguel woke before the sun and stood by the new well, watching the faint thread of water trickle into the trough. The sound was small, almost fragile, yet it filled the stillness like a hymn. He wanted to believe it meant salvation, but deep down he knew it also meant exposure. The world, didn't let miracles stay secret for long. A white SUV appeared that afternoon, dust spiraling behind it like smoke. Mateo Chavez stepped out in a crisp linen shirt, the Desert Pure logo embroidered neatly above his chest pocket. He carried no maps, only confidence, the kind that shines too bright under the desert sun. "Miguel Alvarez," Mateo said warmly, extending a manicured hand. "You've caused quite the stir." Miguel wiped his palms on his jeans, but didn't shake. "Word travels fast for a place that's dying." Mateo smiled, unfazed. "Dying places are what we save. I heard you struck groundwater. Congratulations. That's rare in this region." He glanced toward the well. "A small miracle." "It's not for sale," Miguel said flatly. Mateo chuckled, soft and deliberate. "Everything's for sale, my friend. It's just a matter of what it buys you. I'm not here to take your water. I'm here to give you options." Daniel came out of the barn, dust on his hands. "What kind of options?" The man's gaze shifted to the boy, instantly calculating. "Educational ones. Desert Pure runs a community scholarship program. Young men like you, smart, ambitious, deserve better than a dying farm. And your father here deserves a break from hardship." Miguel stiffened. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," Mateo replied. "It's progress." The words stung like grit in a wound. Miguel remembered how many times he'd heard it from politicians and contractors, always right before they stripped something sacred. "Progress," he said quietly, "used to mean planting trees, not pipelines." Mateo's tone remained silky. "And yet, pipelines carry life now. You've found something extraordinary. With our technology, we can turn it into prosperity, for you, for the town. Think about your neighbors. Think about value. Water rights aren't just legal, they're financial assets. You could retire comfortably." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And when the basin runs dry? When it's gone?" Mateo laughed softly. "Son, we don't drain, we manage. Science, regulation, sustainability. All those fine words. You'd like our team. They're engineers, researchers. Maybe you'll be one of them." The offer hung in the air, heavy as the heat. Miguel saw the flicker in Daniel's eyes, a flash of hope, guilt, temptation. He recognized it because it mirrored his own years ago, when Desert Pure first offered to buy out his neighbors. "I'll think about it," Daniel said quietly. "No," Miguel snapped, the word sharp enough to startle even Cinder, who whinnied from inside the barn. "You'll listen first, then think." Mateo raised his hands, smiling again. "Of course, I'll leave you the papers, just numbers and projections, no obligation." He slipped a sleek folder onto the porch table like it was a gift. "We'll talk soon." When the SUV disappeared down the road, silence fell. Only the wind spoke, brushing through the dry grass. Daniel picked up the folder, turning it over in his hands. "They'd pay enough for you to rebuild," he said. "Fix the pump, the fences, maybe even expand the orchard. It's not evil, Dad. It's business." Miguel looked at his son for a long moment, eyes unreadable. "Business doesn't bury its dead, Daniel. Men do, and sometimes they bury what matters with them." He turned and walked to the barn, needing the quiet. Cinder stood near the trough, muzzle wet from drinking. The horse watched him, ears twitching, sensing the storm building not in the sky, but between father and son. Miguel brushed its mane absently. "They'll come back," he murmured, "with contracts and promises. But they won't understand what—" "You heard, will they? They don't listen." Cinder stamped the ground once, a slow, heavy beat that echoed against the basalt. Inside the house, Daniel read the first page of the folder. It was all neat rows of figures and polished phrases: renewable partnerships, community enhancement, corporate stewardship. At the bottom, one small line caught his eye. Preliminary survey confirms high recharge potential for Desert Pure property rights, Section 14B. His stomach twisted. He wasn't naive enough to miss what that meant. If they took control of the water, the land wouldn't be his father's anymore. It would belong to whoever owned the pipeline. That night, dinner was quiet. Miguel ate without speaking, Daniel pretending to study the papers, and the desert outside holding its breath. When lightning flickered far off over the mesa, both men looked toward it, one seeing a warning, the other a way out. Later, unable to sleep, Daniel went outside. The well gurgled softly under the moonlight. Cinder stood beside it, motionless, eyes reflecting the stars. The horse turned its head toward him, as if it knew his thoughts. "I just want to help him," Daniel whispered. "He's losing everything." The Mustang exhaled, slow and deep. For a moment, Daniel imagined it understood, that it could sense the weight of his choice. Behind him, the house light flicked on. Miguel stepped onto the porch, his silhouette framed in gold. "You thinking of running from this place, or saving it?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "Both, maybe." Miguel came closer, his voice low but steady. "You can't do both. The desert doesn't let you have it both ways. It takes or it gives, but only if you give first." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and faint rain. A distant rumble rolled through the dark. Miguel looked toward the storm and said quietly, almost to himself, "The desert's always making bargains. It just never writes them down." When he went back inside, Daniel stayed behind, the papers clutched in his hand. He stared at the well, the horse, the vast emptiness beyond, and wondered which promise was worth breaking. His father's dream, or his own. The first drops of rain began to fall, whispering against the dry earth like secrets too fragile to speak aloud. The night after Mateo's visit refused to end. Rain never came, only a thin mist that blurred the desert into shades of gray. Miguel lay awake, listening to the faint sound of the well outside, the rhythm of dripping water steady as a heartbeat. Every drop was both a promise and a threat, life for his farm, or bait for those waiting to take it. By morning, the world had turned to pewter. Clouds hung low, heavy with the weight of decisions not yet made. Daniel stood by the porch with the Desert Pure folder still in his hands. He hadn't slept either. His eyes were red, not from tears, but from thinking too long in the dark. "Dad," he said quietly, "I've been looking at, the numbers. If they partner with us, we could keep part of the rights. We'd still have control." Miguel didn't answer right away. He was staring at the walnut tree, where small green buds now clung to the blackened branches. It was the first living thing he'd seen return in years. He didn't want to tell his son that miracles this fragile rarely survived a signature. "You think a contract can share a soul?" Miguel asked finally. Daniel frowned. "I think a contract can pay for college." The words landed like a stone. Miguel turned, his eyes sharp with something that wasn't anger, but fear. "You think money makes you free? It just changes who owns you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You talk like the world hasn't changed, Dad, but it has. Nobody survives on sentiment anymore." Cinder, standing near the trough, let out a low snort, sharp, almost scolding. The sound startled them both. The Mustang pawed the ground twice, then walked toward the basalt ridge. Its tail flicked, its body tense. "What's wrong with him?" Daniel asked. Miguel followed the horse's gaze. In the distance, a black SUV shimmered through the haze, moving slow, deliberate. "They're back," he muttered. Mateo's men didn't come to talk this time. They came to measure. Two workers in hard hats unloaded ground sensors, driving thin rods into the dirt. When Miguel approached, Mateo raised a clipboard like a shield. "Just collecting data," he said smoothly. "Environmental assessment. Perfectly standard." "On my land," Miguel said. "Technically, the water basin extends beyond your boundary," Mateo replied. "Shared resource, shared survey." Miguel's voice dropped to a whisper. "You're not measuring water. You're measuring greed." Cinder stamped the earth again, ears pinned. The workers stepped back instinctively, their equipment beeping in protest. The Mustang's muscles rippled under its ash-gray coat, and for the first time Miguel saw not fear in its movements, but fury. "Hey!" Daniel called, stepping forward, hands raised. "Easy, boy." But the horse wasn't listening to Daniel. It was listening to the ground. A deep, hollow vibration rolled through the ridge. Miguel felt it under his boots, an echo that came from beneath, not above. Then, as suddenly as it began, the tremor stopped. The air went still. Even Mateo's smile faltered. "You feel that?" Miguel asked quietly. Mateo forced a laugh. "Minor shift. Happens all the time." But the workers were already packing up. The earth had reminded them who owned it. When they left, Daniel watched the dust trail fade into the horizon. "You can't fight them forever," he said softly. Miguel nodded. "No, but I can outlast them." That afternoon, he spent hours reinforcing the small reservoir. Every nail he drove into wood felt like an act of defiance. Daniel worked beside him in silence, the tension between them stretched tight, but unbroken. The sun pressed down like judgment. As dusk fell, the water from the well began to run clearer, faster. It filled the trough, then overflowed, carving a thin channel through the sand toward the walnut tree. Miguel stopped and stared as the water wound around the roots, pooling gently at their base. Daniel whispered, "It's feeding it." Miguel didn't move. He just watched the dark soil soak up the water like a blessing. "No," he said softly. "It's remembering." That night, for the first time in months, he dreamed. He saw the land before the drought, when acequias glittered under moonlight, and his wife's laughter floated across the field. He saw Daniel as a child, chasing fireflies near the same tree, his small hands trying to catch the stars. In the dream, the river beneath the desert wasn't just water. It was memory, Ola and patient, waiting for someone to listen again. When he woke before dawn, the dream clung to him like fog. He stepped outside barefoot, the sand cool underfoot. The horizon was a faint line of gold. Daniel was already at the well, adjusting the pump valve. "You're up early," Miguel said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd make sure it's still flowing." Miguel joined him. Together they watched the water spill into the reservoir, steady, shining. Then Daniel turned to him, hesitant. "Dad, I turned down Desert Pure's offer." Miguel blinked. "You did what?" "They wanted me to sign early, to show good faith. I couldn't. Not after yesterday." For a moment, neither spoke. The sun rose higher, turning the water gold. Finally, Miguel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your mother would have been proud." Daniel looked at him, startled. "You think so?" "I know so." Cinder neighed softly from the ridge, and the sound carried across the desert like a note from another time. Miguel turned toward the horse and smiled. "Looks like someone else agrees." The rest of the day passed quietly. They worked without speaking much, patching the trough, cleaning debris, reinforcing the pipes. Every small task felt meaningful now, not as a chore, but as an act of belonging. At sunset, clouds gathered again. A single drop of rain fell onto the water's surface, sending ripples outward. Daniel laughed, tilting his face to the sky. Miguel looked up too, but the clouds drifted on, refusing to break. "Teasing us," he said. "Or reminding us," Daniel replied. Miguel glanced at his son, surprised by the calm in his voice. Maybe the boy was learning what he himself had once forgotten. That hope doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just drips, patient and quiet, until the land is ready to listen. As darkness fell, the farm hummed with small sounds: frogs in the trough, wind in the trees, the low sigh of the pump. For the first time in years, the desert didn't feel empty. It felt alive. But in the distance, beyond the basalt ridge, faint headlights glimmered. Desert, pure trucks returning under cover of night. The storm hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. Miguel tightened his jaw, eyes narrowing. "Let them come," he whispered. "We've got more than water now. We've got reason." Cinder lifted its head, ears forward, muscles tense against the wind. The Mustang stood like a shadow carved in silver, ready for whatever came next. The night desert pure returned. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Miguel didn't light the porch lamp. He stood in the shadow of the adobe wall, watching the slow crawl of headlights approach from the ridge. Beside him, Cinder was motionless, its dark coat blending with the night. Only the soft flare of its nostrils showed it was awake, alert, waiting. The trucks stopped near the boundary fence. Two men got out, speaking in low tones, their flashlights sweeping the ground like searchlights. Daniel stirred inside the house, coming to the window. "Dad?" he whispered. "Stay inside," Miguel said. "Lock the door." But Daniel stepped out anyway. "They can't just take readings without permission." His voice trembled with anger, but there was courage in it too. The kind that hadn't been there before. Mateo emerged from one of the trucks, immaculate as always, his white shirt glowing faintly under the moon. "Evening, Miguel," he called out. "Sorry for the intrusion. We're simply conducting follow-up surveys, standard procedure after seismic activity." Miguel's voice was calm. Too calm. "The only seismic activity here was caused by your greed shaking the ground." Mateo smiled faintly. "You really should be thanking us. That water source of yours? It's sitting on a fault line. You need proper testing before it collapses, or worse, contaminates the basin. We're trying to help." Daniel stepped closer, fists clenched. "Help who? Your investors?" Mateo's eyes flicked toward him, sharp. "You're a bright kid, Daniel. Don't waste that on sentiment. You could be working with us, learning real science, not superstition." The boy hesitated, but Miguel spoke before the silence could grow. "My father taught me something you'll never learn from a lab, Chavez. The land doesn't belong to you just because you can measure it." Cinder let out a low sound then, a deep, chesty rumble that rolled through the night like thunder. The horse pawed the ground once, hard, and the echo traveled through the dirt, startling the workers. Mateo's composure wavered. "Control your animal, Alvarez." "Funny," Miguel said. "That's what the land's been telling you." The men backed toward their trucks, muttering. Mateo turned to leave, but not before tossing over his shoulder. "You can't stop progress, Miguel. Eventually the county will decide who owns that water, and it won't be you." When the engines faded into distance, Daniel turned to his father. "He's bluffing, right?" Miguel's silence said everything. The next morning, the sky opened like a bruise. A thin storm line hovered above the horizon, refusing to break, teasing with thunder. The well still ran, but slower now. The water carried fine grains of red clay. An omen. Miguel crouched beside it, dipped his fingers in. The temperature was colder than before. "Dad?" Daniel asked from behind him. "It's different." Miguel nodded. The fault shifted. They drilled too close. He felt it deep in his chest, the fragility of what they had built, how quickly greed could tilt the balance. Every drop that came up now felt stolen, as if the earth were reconsidering its mercy. They spent the day inspecting the pipes, reinforcing the reservoir walls. The sound of tools clanged against the rhythm of distant thunder. Once, when Daniel climbed the ladder to tighten a bolt, Miguel called out, "Careful!" The word came out sharper than intended. "I'm fine," Daniel said, wiping his brow. "I know," Miguel replied softly, regret in his tone. By afternoon, the storm finally broke. Rain swept across the mesa in silver sheets. The first drops hit the dust, releasing that scent of petrichor, the smell of hope waking up. Miguel stood in it, face turned upward, eyes closed. Daniel laughed, running to the walnut tree, shouting something the wind stole away. When Miguel opened his eyes, he saw Cinder galloping along the fence line, wild and magnificent, mane plastered to its neck. The horse reared once, kicking at the air as if to greet the rain itself. But beauty in the desert never lasted long. The wind shifted violently, and within minutes the rainfall turned fierce. Water pooled fast around the well, rushing toward the arroyo. Miguel shouted for Daniel to get back, but the boy was already by the trough, struggling to move the hoses out of the rising flood. "Leave it!" Miguel yelled, sprinting toward him. "Let it go!" Lightning ripped the sky open. Cinder whinnied loud enough to drown the thunder, eyes wide, hooves slashing mud. The sound of rushing water deepened, filling the ravine like a hungry thing. Daniel slipped. Miguel lunged, grabbing his arm just in time. They both stumbled backward as a surge of muddy water tore past them, ripping the trough loose and sending it spinning downstream. For a heartbeat, everything went silent, just the hiss of rain and the roar of water below. When they finally reached the safety of the porch, drenched and shaking, Daniel dropped onto the steps, breathing hard. Miguel knelt beside him. "You could have been swept away." Daniel looked up, water streaming down his face. "I was trying to save it," he said. "All of it." Miguel placed a hand on his shoulder, gripping tight. "Don't. You're the only thing I can't lose." Neither spoke after that. The rain eased slowly, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and the shimmer of puddles reflecting lightning's afterglow. Inside, as they dried off by the stove, Miguel watched his son stare into the flames. There were words he wanted to say. Apologies, fears, things buried deep since his wife's death. But they caught in his throat. He'd spent years letting silence protect him from pain, only to realize it had built a wall between them. Daniel turned, catching his gaze. "Dad," he said quietly. "I didn't mean—" Miguel interrupted gently. "I know, and I didn't mean to let you feel alone." For the first time, neither of them looked away. Outside, Cinder stood under the walnut tree, rain dripping from its mane, steady as a statue. The storm had left scars in the ground, but it had also filled the small reservoir to the brim. Miguel rose and stepped to the window. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we'll see what survived." Daniel nodded, understanding more in that single line than any long explanation could hold. The next morning, when the storm clouds cleared, they found the reservoir full and glistening like a mirror. The water shimmered gold in the first sunlight, carrying reflections of scant hope. For a moment, both father and son simply stood there, silent. Because sometimes, after too many words unspoken, silence finally becomes enough. Cinder walked forward and lowered its muzzle to the surface, drinking deeply. Miguel watched the ripples spread and thought, so long as the land still listens, so can we. The morning after the storm was almost too quiet. The sky, freshly washed, stretched endless and pale over the desert. The air smelled of wet sage and clay, the rare perfume that came only after rain. Miguel walked to the reservoir barefoot, his boots dangling from one hand. The ground was soft, the kind that remembered every footprint. The water shimmered gold beneath the sunrise, still and full, a miracle carved by struggle. But Miguel's joy was cautious. Nature never gave without testing what you'd do to keep it. Daniel joined him, still half asleep, hair sticking out in damp clumps. "Looks like it survived," he said. Miguel nodded. "For now." They stood in silence, the kind that feels like prayer. Cinder grazed nearby, tail swishing lazily, as if keeping rhythm with the calm. The Mustang's coat glowed in the soft light, the scars along its flank faint silver now, not angry red. Then Miguel noticed something, an oily shimmer on the surface of the water. Faint, but undeniable. He crouched, dipping his hand. A slick residue clung to his fingers. "What is that?" Daniel asked. Miguel rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, eyes narrowing. "Fuel. Diesel, maybe." Daniel's face drained of color. "You think they—" "I don't think," Miguel said. "I know." Desert Pure had returned to finish what the rain couldn't wash away. By afternoon, they confirmed it. A small drainage pipe, half buried and hidden behind a cluster of rocks, fed runoff from the north side of the ridge directly into the reservoir. The storm had carried everything downhill, including oil from the company's drilling trucks. Miguel knelt beside the pipe, heart pounding. "They poisoned it," he whispered. "Even the water we found. They'll take it from us, drop by drop." Daniel clenched his fists. "We can report them. Call the environmental office. They'll come with permits," Miguel interrupted bitterly. "Paperwork to prove it was an accident." Neil arrived just before sunset, his truck rattling over the mud. When he saw the contamination, his face went pale. "Damn it. I warned them this terrain couldn't handle heavy equipment." "They didn't make a mistake," Miguel said. "They made a statement." Neil sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I can test it. If the sample shows chemical trace, it'll prove they're at fault. But you'll need patience. Legal battles take time." Miguel looked out at the land, jaw tight. "Time's what we're running out of." As the sun sank, they drained the top layer of water into a separate trough, filtering what they could through cloth and gravel. Cinder drank only from the runoff near the old well, refusing the main reservoir. The horse seemed to sense what the humans didn't yet know how to fix. That night, Miguel sat by the window, watching moonlight ripple on the tainted surface. He felt a weight heavier than anger. something like grief, not just for the water, but for the faith it had cost to believe it might save them. Daniel entered quietly, a folded paper in his hand. "It's the scholarship offer," he said. "They resent it. Said it's still open if I sign by Friday." Miguel didn't look up. "And what do you want me to say?" Daniel hesitated. "Nothing. Just, maybe you should let me go." The words landed like thunder. Miguel turned slowly. "You think running from this place will fix it?" "I think staying will break you," Daniel said, voice trembling. "You're fighting ghosts, Dad. Maybe that's faith to you, but to me, it's a cage." Miguel stood, his chair scraping the floor. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks of the old adobe wall. "Go then," he said finally. "If the desert's too quiet for you, go find noise somewhere else." Daniel swallowed hard. "That's not what I meant." "Doesn't matter," Miguel said, turning away. "You've said what you needed to." The boy left the room, slamming the door so hard the window rattled. Outside, Cinder neighed sharply, startled by the noise. The sound cut through the silence like a warning. Miguel sat down again, his anger dissolving into something softer. Fear, maybe, or love he didn't know how to show. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had once built this farm, now stained with oil from poisoned water. He wondered if this was what faith cost. Not belief, but endurance. Hours passed. The moon climbed high, silvering the desert. Finally, Miguel rose and walked outside. Daniel sat near the well, head bowed, shoulders shaking slightly. Without a word, Miguel sat beside him. They stayed like that for a long while, neither speaking, the cool air humming around them. Finally, Daniel whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt you." Miguel nodded slowly. "And I didn't mean to hold you so tight you couldn't breathe." He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small glass jar filled with clear water, the sample from the first day they struck the vein. He held it up so the moonlight caught it. "This," he said, "is what we're fighting for. Not the land, not the well, the truth of what's alive beneath it." Daniel looked at the jar, then at his father. "And if it costs everything?" Miguel smiled faintly. "Then it's worth exactly that." Cinder approached from the shadows, lowering its head until its muzzle brushed Miguel's shoulder. The horse's breath was warm against the night. It stood between them like a sentinel, a living bridge across years of distance. When the dawn came, it painted everything in soft gold again, but the world felt changed. The reservoir still shimmered, though the oil streaks had thinned. Miguel's eyes caught a reflection in the water. The faint outline of Cinder and Daniel standing side by side, their silhouettes rippling together. He thought of the word faith. It wasn't about believing that everything would be saved. It was about standing when nothing else would. That morning, as he began rebuilding the filtration trough, Daniel joined him wordlessly, handing over tools without being asked. They didn't need to talk anymore. Some things, like forgiveness, worked better in silence. By afternoon, Neil returned with his test kit. "You were right," he said. "Diesel trace confirmed. Enough to file a formal complaint." Miguel nodded, the fire rekindling in his eyes. "Then let's make it official." He looked at the horizon, where the sun dipped low behind the ridge, and thought about the price of faith. The water lost, the nights sleepless, the words that had to be said to bring a son back to his father. As the wind carried the scent of sage and rain once more, Miguel whispered to the desert, I'm still here. And somewhere beneath the ground, the land seemed to whisper back. The days that followed felt borrowed, too calm, too golden. The desert stretched wide and deceptively gentle under a sky washed clean by the rain. Miguel and Daniel worked from sunrise to dusk, building a stronger filtration system and fortifying the new water lines. Each task carried a fragile rhythm of peace. The poisoned layer had thinned, the reservoir shimmered almost pure again. But behind that stillness, something was gathering. Even Cinder sensed it. The Mustang had grown restless, pacing along the fence line each night, nostrils flaring toward the north where dark clouds gathered beyond the mountains. Miguel noticed. "He knows before we do," he said one evening, tightening the last bolt on the pipe joint. Neil, crouched beside him with a clipboard, smiled faintly. "Animals don't wait for radar. The air changes, they feel it in their bones." He glanced at the horizon. "And so should we." Miguel straightened, stretching his stiff back. "Monsoon season's late this year, but it's coming." Daniel, sitting on the edge of the trough, wiped the sweat from his neck. "So we just wait for it to wash everything clean?" Miguel looked at his son, half smiling. "The desert doesn't wash clean, Daniel. It just remembers differently." That night, the wind shifted. A heavy silence fell before dawn, the kind that makes every sound sharper. The scrape of boots on stone, the sigh of wood, even the heartbeat of the land beneath your feet. When Miguel stepped outside, the air smelled charged, electric. The clouds above the Organ Mountains flickered with distant lightning. He went to check the horses. Only Cinder remained outside the stall, standing tall, ears forward. The Mustang's eyes caught the lightning flashes like twin embers. Miguel reached up and stroked its neck. "You'll tell me when it's time," he whispered. By morning, the first gusts arrived, whipping dust into the yard. The sky had turned a strange color, between rust and violet. The windmill groaned. Miguel and Daniel worked quickly, securing tarps, moving tools, covering the generator. When Neil arrived, his old truck rattling under the wind, his expression was grim. "County issued a flood advisory," he said. "Storm cells tracking straight for Agua Clara." Miguel wiped his brow. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the arroyo could turn into a river in under an hour." Daniel glanced toward the ridge. "That's right where the reservoir drains." Miguel's stomach tightened. "Then we need to reinforce it now." They worked furiously. The storm advanced like a slow beast, devouring light. The first drops were thick and cold, slapping the dust into dark spots that spread fast. Thunder rolled low and endless. Miguel and Daniel hammered wooden stakes, reinforcing the reservoir wall. Cinder trotted nearby, agitated, tossing its head against the wind. The horse whinnied sharply, almost like a warning. "Dad!" Daniel shouted over the rising roar. "The water's already building in the arroyo!" Miguel turned. What he saw made his chest seize. Down in the ravine, a narrow ribbon of water was expanding, thickening, carrying debris. Within minutes, it would be a torrent. "Get to high ground!" Miguel yelled. But Daniel was already halfway down the slope, trying to move the hose that fed into the lower trough. "If the hose snaps, it'll drain the reservoir," he shouted back. "Leave it!" Miguel called, panic cutting through the wind. The sky split open with lightning, white fire against the violet clouds. Thunder followed like an explosion. The ground trembled. Cinder reared, screaming into the storm. Miguel could barely see Daniel through the sheets of rain. He slid down the muddy slope, grabbing for his son's arm. The water surged around their boots, cold and fast. "We have to go," he yelled. Daniel looked up, soaked, his face streaked with mud and determination. "I can fix it. Just another second." The sound that came next was like the earth breaking. A section of the reservoir wall gave way, sending a wave of muddy water into the arroyo. It slammed into them, knocking both off their feet. Miguel went under, the world spinning in darkness. When he surfaced, gasping, he saw Daniel clinging to a broken fence post. "Hold on!" he screamed, fighting against the current. Cinder appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the storm. The Mustang plunged down the slope, mud flying, hooves striking sparks on the basalt. Miguel couldn't believe what he was seeing. The horse waded into the torrent, muscles straining, fighting the current until it reached Daniel. The boy's arms wrapped around its neck instinctively. Cinder turned, bracing against the flow, inch by inch, pulling toward higher ground. Miguel stumbled after them, heart pounding. When they finally reached the ridge, Daniel collapsed, coughing, soaked to the bone. Miguel fell beside him, shaking, unable to speak. Rain lashed against their faces. Cinder stood over them, sides heaving, the lightning painting its body silver and black. For a long time, they just breathed. No words, no sound, but the storm. Then Daniel whispered hoarsely, "He saved me." Miguel looked up at the Mustang, chest tightening. "No," he said softly. "He saved both of us." The storm raged through the night. They took shelter in the barn, listening as rain hammered the roof and wind howled through every crack. Cinder stood near the door, watching the darkness, as if guarding it. By dawn, the air was still again. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. When they stepped outside, the land was unrecognizable. Trees uprooted, fences torn, the reservoir nearly gone. But the well still flowed, clear and steady. Daniel crouched beside it, touching the water with trembling fingers. "It's still here," he said. Miguel nodded slowly. "Because it belongs to the ground, not to us." He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing out of the wreckage, red and unyielding. The desert shimmered, not in defeat, but in survival. Cinder limped slightly as it walked toward them, mud clinging to its legs. Miguel pressed a hand to its neck, whispering, "Thank you." The horse exhaled, warm and alive, and for that moment, everything else fell away. The broken fences, the washed-out field, the debt, the danger. There was only the quiet truth of what had endured. They would rebuild. The desert would heal. And in the stillness after the storm, Miguel understood. Faith wasn't about winning. It was about standing where everything else had fallen, still listening for the heartbeat beneath the mud. The world smelled of iron and ash the morning after the flood. The air was thick with humidity, as if the desert hadn't yet decided whether to breathe again. Miguel stepped out of the barn slowly, his body aching from exhaustion and the night's chaos. His boots sank into the wet sand. Everywhere he looked, the land bore new scars, gullies carved deep by water, fences snapped like matchsticks, the old walnut tree standing half-buried in silt. But through the wreckage, a sound still lived, the quiet gurgle of the well. The water was running clear. That, Miguel thought, was miracle enough. Daniel emerged behind him, his face pale from lack of sleep, his clothes still damp. He looked around, eyes wide. "It's all gone," he whispered. Not all, Miguel said. Look closer. The boy followed his gaze. In the middle of the ruined yard, small shoots of green pushed through the mud, fragile, trembling, but alive. The same roots that had been dying for years had drunk the flood and found strength again. Neil's truck appeared on the road around mid-morning, tires grinding through the muck. He climbed out slowly, surveying the devastation. I saw the ridge from town, he said. Thought you might have washed away. Almost did, Miguel replied with a dry smile. Neil stepped closer to the reservoir, now little more than a broken basin filled with debris. He knelt, dipping his hand in. Still cold. That's good. Means the aquifer's open. The storm probably cleared the fractures instead of sealing them. Miguel let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. So the water's safe? For now, Neil said. But the flood changed everything downstream. Desert Pure will use that. They'll argue it was their infrastructure that kept the basin from collapsing. Daniel frowned. They're really going to claim credit for this? Neil nodded grimly. They always do. Progress loves a good story. Miguel looked toward the North Ridge, where the company's survey flags still fluttered in the wind. Then maybe it's time we tell a better one. That afternoon, they walked the property, taking photographs, collecting samples, marking the line where the floodwater had crested. Miguel felt every step in his bones. The sun was back, burning off the moisture until the air shimmered again. It was like the desert pretending nothing had happened. Cinder followed close behind, limping slightly but steady. Daniel ran his hand along the horse's flank, murmuring softly. He saved me, Dad. He really did. Miguel smiled faintly. He's got more sense than either of us. They reached the edge of the arroyo, now a wide scar filled with drying mud. The sound of water still trickled beneath the surface, a reminder that life had moved underground, unseen but unbroken. Miguel knelt, pressing his palm to the earth. It was cool, vibrating faintly. It's still moving, he said softly. The water. It didn't stop. Neil crouched beside him. Water never stops, Miguel. It just finds a new way. Daniel looked down at them both, eyes shining. Maybe that's what we do too. When evening fell, the town came. Word had spread. Neighbors, friends, people from Agua Clara who once pitied the Alvarez's barren land now arrived with shovels and buckets. They came not out of charity, but gratitude. The flood had filled their own wells again, sent water trickling through forgotten acequias. It's from your land, one man said. The runoff carried through the basin. Whatever you did, you saved the valley. Miguel felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to tell them it wasn't him, that it was the horse, the rain, the stubbornness of the earth. But the words stuck. He simply nodded. Then let's make sure it stays that way. They worked by lantern light, clearing debris, channeling runoff into small trenches that would feed the surrounding fields. Cinder stood nearby, watching as if overseeing the labor. Daniel guided the younger kids, laughing when they splashed in the mud. For the first time in months, the sound of joy returned to the Alvarez farm. Later that night, when the others left, Miguel sat on the porch with Neil, both men silent. The desert stretched out before them, black and endless. The stars reflected faintly in the puddles still dotting the yard. You ever think it'd come to this? Neil asked quietly. Miguel shook his head. I thought the land would take everything from me. Turns out it was waiting to give it back. Neil smiled, the lines on his face deepening. You earned it, my friend. You listened when no one else would. Miguel looked toward Cinder, resting near the barn. He listened first. Neil followed his gaze. Then maybe we should all learn from him. A faint breeze stirred the sagebrush, carrying the smell of wet earth. Miguel thought of his wife then, the way she used to hum while hanging laundry, the way she'd said, "This land will speak to you if you let it." Maybe she'd always known. Daniel joined them on the porch, tired but content. He leaned against the post, arms folded. "Town's calling it Cinder's Spring," he said with a grin. "They want to put up a sign by the road." Miguel blinked, caught off guard. "Cinder's Spring?" "Yeah," said it sounded right. Miguel smiled slowly. "It does." They sat together in the quiet, the three of them, father, son, and horse, framed by the faint glow of the lantern. The land was wounded, yes, but it was alive. The flood hadn't destroyed their hope. It had exposed what had been buried beneath it. When dawn returned, Miguel rose early. The world was new again, damp and shimmering. He walked to the well, drew a handful of water, and drank. It was cold and clean. He let the last drops fall back into the basin, whispering, "Thank you." The ground beneath his feet seemed to answer with a low, steady hum, the sound of life beginning again. And for the first time in his life, Miguel Alvarez didn't feel alone. Autumn came quietly, slipping into the valley without ceremony. The desert, once scorched and brittle, now carried a strange gentleness. Grass sprouted in pale tufts along the ridge. The walnut tree had grown new leaves, small, trembling, but alive. Every morning, mist curled over the reservoir, the air tasting of metal and rain. It was a season the people of Agua Clara hadn't seen in decades, and they called it a gift. Miguel called it grace. The Alvarez farm was no longer a place of silence. Trucks came and went, neighbors bringing tools, families drawing water, children running barefoot in the wet soil. What had once been a dying homestead had become the heart of a community. They came not to take, but to share. Daniel handled most of the organization, charting schedules for irrigation, helping install pumps, and teaching villagers how to balance the flow between homes. Miguel watched him with quiet pride. The boy who once dreamed of escape was now rooted deeper than any fence post. One afternoon, Daniel was bent over a ledger, scribbling notes when he looked up. "We need to limit the drawdown hours," he said. "Too much at once and we'll drain pressure." Miguel chuckled. "When did you become the one giving orders?" Daniel grinned. "When you finally started listening." They laughed together, a sound as healing as rain. Cinder grazed nearby, healthy again, the shine returning to its coat. The horse had become something of a legend among the townspeople. Kids brought it apples and carrots, whispering stories about how it had found the river under the sand. Miguel never corrected them. Some stories didn't need truth to be real. They just needed belief. One day, a group of men arrived from Desert Pure. Different faces this time. Younger, smoother, wearing field jackets with polite smiles. They brought clipboards, cameras, and phrases like corporate partnership and environmental stewardship. Their leader, a man named Rogers, spoke gently, as though addressing an old friend. "We'd like to help, Mr. Alvarez," Rogers said. "Your spring could be part of a regional conservation program. Grants, publicity. This could benefit everyone." Miguel studied the man's hands. Soft, unscarred. "You mean it could benefit you?" he said. Rogers smiled thinly. "We all benefit when progress is shared." Daniel stepped forward before Miguel could reply. "You had your chance," he said. "You tried to poison this land, and it survived without you. We're not signing anything." Roger's face didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "Careful, son. Ownership's complicated out here. Water moves. Boundaries blur." Miguel stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "Not this water. Not anymore." When the men left, the air felt lighter. Daniel looked at his father. "You think they'll come back?" Miguel nodded. "They always do, but this time they won't find us waiting alone." That evening, the town gathered for a meeting at the farm. The old church bell was gone, so Miguel struck an iron horseshoe against a post, and the metallic ring carried across the fields. People came with lanterns, folding chairs, and baskets of food. It wasn't just a meeting, it felt like a ceremony. When everyone had settled, Miguel stood before them. "This land has tested us," he began. "It's taken our pride, our patience, and sometimes our hope. But it's also given us back something we lost, the belief that we belong to it, not the other way around." He paused, looking around at the faces lit by firelight. Neighbors, families, even strangers who had once doubted him. "The spring isn't mine," he said. "It's ours. And it stays that way. No contracts. No price." A murmur of approval swept through the crowd. Someone started clapping, and soon the sound grew, a wave of gratitude rising under the desert stars. Later, as people dispersed, Miguel sat by the reservoir, staring at the still water reflecting the moon. Daniel joined him, handing over a thermos of coffee. "Neil says the aquifer's stabilizing," he said. "The flow rate's consistent. We might even expand the channel by spring." Miguel smiled. "You talk like you've been doing this your whole life." "Maybe I have," Daniel said, sipping his coffee. "Just didn't know it until now." They sat in comfortable silence. Somewhere nearby, Cinder whinnied softly, its reflection rippling on the water. Miguel leaned back, looking up at the stars. "You know," he said quietly, "your mother used to say, faith isn't about believing things will work out. It's about staying when they don't." Daniel nodded, eyes glistening. "I think I get that now." From the hill above the farm, faint music drifted down. Someone had brought a guitar, playing an old folk tune that mingled with the sound of frogs by the water. The town was alive again, the kind of life that doesn't depend on profit or luck, but on shared endurance. Miguel watched Daniel walk toward the group, joining the laughter and music. The boy carried himself differently now, taller, steadier, not with defiance, but with belonging. Cinder stepped beside Miguel, nudging his shoulder gently. "Go on," Miguel murmured to the horse. "He's your miracle, not mine." The Mustang huffed softly and lowered its head, brushing Miguel's sleeve before turning to graze. The gesture was small, but it spoke louder than words. As night deepened, Miguel felt the weight of everything that had come before, the drought, the loss, the flood, and realized none of it had been wasted. The land had burned them down to what was true, and now it was growing something new in the ashes. Trust. The moon rose higher, bright as polished bone. The water of Cinder's spring shimmered beneath it, carrying the reflection of everything it had healed. And somewhere in that reflection, Miguel saw not the man who had once wanted to sell his land, but the one who had learned how to listen to it again. The first light of winter rose slow and golden over the Chihuahuan desert. A thin mist curled above Cinder's spring, catching the dawn in tiny sparks of silver. The air was crisp and still. broken only by the faint rustle of wind against the sagebrush and the low hum of life returning. Miguel stood at the edge of the reservoir, hands deep in his pockets, watching the reflection of the walnut tree in the water. Once bare and brittle, its branches now spread wide, green against the pale sky. It wasn't a miracle in the way people expected, not sudden, not divine, but it was enough. The kind of quiet transformation that only patience could make. Behind him, Daniel's voice broke the silence. "Town council approved the new name," he said. "They're calling it Cinder's Spring officially. It'll go on the maps." Miguel turned, smiling softly. "Guess that horse of ours made history." Daniel grinned. "More like he made believers out of everyone." They walked together along the fence line. The ground still bore scars from the flood, deep channels that twisted through the fields like veins, but new grass was growing there. The land was healing in its own time, the same way people did. As they reached the barn, Cinder lifted his head from the trough. His coat had grown thick for winter, black with streaks of silver where the sun hit. He stepped toward them, ears twitching, his breath steaming in the cold air. Daniel stroked his muzzle gently. "He doesn't even look like the same horse," he said. Miguel nodded. "None of us do." The Mustang snorted, then looked toward the hills, where faint plumes of dust rose from a convoy of vehicles winding down the distant road. Miguel shaded his eyes. "They're coming," he murmured. Daniel followed his gaze. "Desert pure?" "Maybe," Miguel said. "Or maybe just people wanting to see what they missed." By noon, the vehicles arrived. 2 county trucks, a reporter's van, and behind them, Mateo's black SUV. He stepped out, immaculate as always, though the desert heat had replaced his usual calm with a sheen of sweat. "Mr. Alvarez," Mateo greeted, adjusting his sunglasses. "Quite the story you've built here." He gestured toward the water, the fields, the families working in the distance. "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd last this long." Miguel's tone was even. "You didn't think the land would." Mateo smiled tightly. "And yet here we are. Agua Clara's thriving again. Investors are talking about development, ecotourism, sustainable agriculture. It's good for everyone." Daniel stepped forward, folding his arms. "We already told your company we're not interested." Mateo turned his smile on the boy, smooth and sharp as glass. "I'm not here to buy, son. I'm here to offer gratitude. Desert Pure wants to fund a preservation grant. No contracts, just recognition." Miguel studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "Recognition usually comes with a leash." The man laughed softly. "You're too cynical." "Maybe," Miguel said. "Or maybe I've just learned what things cost." The conversation ended there. Miguel turned away, not in anger, but with the calm of someone who no longer needed to argue. Mateo lingered for a few moments, then left without another word. The dust from his tires rose into the wind, twisting briefly before vanishing. That evening, the townspeople gathered again by the water. They came carrying small jars and pouches of soil, one from every household. It had been Daniel's idea, inspired by something his mother used to say. "We return what gives us life." As the sun lowered, painting the desert in amber and rose, Miguel stood before them. "This land remembers us," he said. "Every drop of sweat, every prayer, every mistake. It remembers because it was part of us before we ever claimed it. Today, we give it back what we took." One by one, families stepped forward, emptying their soil into the water. The surface rippled with each offering, catching the fading light like a mirror of all their shared histories. When it was Daniel's turn, he held his jar tightly, then poured it slowly. "For Mom," he whispered. Miguel felt his throat tighten. He stepped up beside his son, clutching his own handful of earth. "For everything we almost lost," he said softly, and let it fall. The crowd stood silent. Cinder walked to the water's edge and lowered his muzzle, drinking deeply. When he lifted his head, droplets fell from his chin, catching the last of the sunlight. It was as if the land itself bowed in acknowledgement. Later, when the people had gone, Miguel and Danielle remained by the reservoir. The sky deepened to indigo, stars appearing one by one. The reflection of the walnut tree wavered in the still water, branches reaching toward the heavens like open arms. Daniel broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving?" Miguel smiled faintly. "Once, every day. Now I think about staying." Daniel nodded, eyes glistening in the starlight. "Me too." Cinder shifted behind them, snorting softly. The sound blended with the whisper of wind through the sage. Miguel looked toward the horse, then back at his son. "You know, when I found him, I thought he was a curse. One more mouth to feed on a land that had nothing left. Turns out, he was the first thing that listened when I stopped talking." Daniel smiled. "Maybe he heard what the land was trying to tell you." Miguel chuckled, his voice low. "Maybe he was the land." They stood there together, father and son, until the moon rose high enough to silver the edges of everything it touched. The fences, the barn, the ripples on the water, the scars of the flood now softened into gentle curves. When they finally turned to leave, Miguel glanced back once more. The reflection of the horse and the walnut tree shimmered side by side on the surface of the spring. For a moment it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He thought of all the years he'd spent fighting what he didn't understand, all the things he'd lost by not listening sooner. Now the silence no longer frightened him. It was full. It was alive. "Come on, boy," he said to Cinder, patting its neck. "Let's go home." As they walked toward the house, Daniel carried the empty jar in his hand, holding it to his chest as though it still contained something precious. Maybe it did. Behind them, Cinder's spring shimmered beneath the stars, a pool of living memory, born from faith, loss, and the quiet miracle that the desert had hidden beneath its dust all along. The land had spoken, and at last, someone had listened. If this story touched something in you, if you believe miracles still hide beneath the dust, leave a simple comment. 1. It tells me you're still listening, still believing in second chances. Don't forget to subscribe, because more stories like this one are coming. Stories of people, animals, and the quiet moments that change everything. Stay with us. The next story may find you.